Now begins the recitation of the Aletheon, the divine avataric self-revelation of His divine presence, Avatar Adi Da Samraj. This is the great esoteric tradition of devotion to the ADEPT-REALIZER. Spiritually realized adepts, or transmission masters, or true gurus, are the principal sources, resources, and means of the esoteric or spiritual way. This fact is not and never has been a matter of controversy among real spiritual practitioners. The entire spiritual way is a process based on the understanding and the transcending of attention, or the understanding and the transcending of the inevitable and specific results of egoic attachment to, or egoic reaction to, or egoic self-identification with every kind of conditional object, other, or state. This spiritual understanding, or real self-understanding, is expressed in a simple traditional formula and prescription for practice. You become or duplicate the qualities of whatever you meditate on, or whatever you identify with via the surrender that is attention itself. Since the most ancient days, this understanding has informed and inspired the practice of real practitioners of the spiritual way. Likewise, since the most ancient days, and on the basis of this very understanding, spiritual practitioners have affirmed that the great principle of spiritual practice is the spiritual company of the realized adept, or the practice of life as self-surrender to the bodily person, the transmitted spiritual presence, and the realized state of a spiritually realized adept or true guru of whatever degree or stage. The traditional term guru, spelled with a capital G, means one who reveals the light and thereby liberates beings from darkness. This term is also commonly or popularly interpreted in a general or everyday sense, and spelled with a small g to mean teacher, or anyone who teaches anything at all to another. Thus, adepts have certainly and rightly been valued simply or in the general sense as small g gurus. That is, simply because they can instruct others about many things, including the spiritual way. However, the function of instruction about anything at all can be performed by anyone who is properly informed, or even by a book that is properly informed. And, indeed, even the specific function of spiritual instruction is secondary to the great function of the adept as guru with a capital G. Adepts inevitably, or at least in the majority of cases, instruct or teach others. But the function of instruction about the spiritual way is then passed on through good books containing the authentic word of teaching, and through informed others who are, hopefully, true practitioners, and so forth. The great function of the adept guru is, however, specific only to adepts themselves, and this is the guru function and the guru principle, supremely valued by spiritual practitioners since the most ancient days. The specific guru function is associated with the great principle of devotional communion with the adept guru and with the unique spiritual understanding of attention. Therefore, Since the most ancient days, all truly established or real spiritual practitioners have understood that devotional communion with the Adept Guru is, itself, the great means for realizing real acausal God, or truth itself, or reality itself. That is to say, the great means, or secret, of realization in the spiritual way is to live in or to spend significant time in, or otherwise and constantly to give attention to the company, form, presence, and state of an adept who is truly realized in one or another of the esoteric stages of life. The essence of the practice of devotional communion with the Adept Guru is to focus attention on, and thereby to, in due course, become identified with, or realize indivisible oneness with, the realized condition of a true Adept Guru, especially one who is presently and constantly in samadhi, or in the actual state of true realization. However, and by whatever term of reference, realization is described in any particular tradition or school. Therefore, the practice of devotional communion with the Adept Guru is the practice of ego-transcending communion and, ultimately, indivisible oneness with the Adept's own condition, which is, according to the degree or stage of the Adept's characteristic realization, samadhi itself, or the Adept's characteristic and freely, spontaneously, and universally transmitted realization itself. Based on the understanding of attention, or the observation that consciousness itself, in the context of the body-mind self, tends to identify with, or becomes fixed in association with, whatever attention observes, and especially with whatever attention surrenders to most fully. The spiritual motive is essentially the motive to transcend the limiting capability of attention, or of all conditional objects, others, and states. Therefore, the traditional spiritual process, as a conventional technique begun in the context of the fourth stage of life, is an effort or struggle to set attention, and thus consciousness itself, free by progressively relinquishing attachment and reaction to conditional objects, others, and states. And, ultimately, this process requires the most perfect transcending of egoity or self-contraction itself, or all the egoic limitations associated with and all of the first 6 stages of life, or all of the egoic limitations associated with each and all of the first 6 stages of life. This conventional effort or struggle is profound and difficult, and it tends to progress slowly. Therefore, some few adopt the path of extraordinary self-effort, or a most intense struggle of relinquishment, which is asceticism, or the method of absolute independence. However, the adepts themselves have, since the most ancient days, offered an alternative to mere and at best slowly progressing self-effort. Indeed, the Adept Gurus offer a unique principle of practice as an alternative to the conventional principle of mere and independent self-effort and relinquishment. That unique principle is the principle of supreme attraction. Truly, the bondage of attention to conditional objects, others, and states must be really transcended in the spiritual way, but mere self-effort or struggle with the separate and separative self is a principle that originates in and constantly reinforces the separate and separative self or self-contraction, or egoity itself. Therefore, the process of the real transcending of bondage to conditions is made direct and truly ego-transcending if the principle of independent self-effort or egoic struggle is at least progressively replaced by the responsive or cooperative principle of supreme attraction, which is, in its fullness, responsive, devotional, and spiritual identification with the free person, presence, and state of one who is already realized or in samadhi. On the basis of the simple understanding of attention expressed in the formula, you become or realize what or who you meditate on. The ancient essence of the spiritual way is to meditate on and otherwise to commune with the adept guru, and thereby to be attracted or grown beyond the self-contraction or egoity or the self-limiting tendencies of attention or all self-limiting and self-binding association with conditional objects, others, and states. Through sympathetic or responsive spiritual identification with the spiritually self-transmitted state of a realizer, the devotee is spiritually infused and potentially awakened by the inherently attractive power of that state itself. Even the simplest beginner in practice may be directly inspired and thus move toward greater practice, true devotion, and eventual spiritual awakening by sympathetic response to the free sign and the great demonstration of a true realizer, and by the great spiritual means that is true devotional communion with a true realizer, coupled with a variety of disciplines and practices which should be associated with real self-understanding. The fully prepared devotee of a true realizer may freely or with relative effortlessness relinquish or grow beyond the limits of attention relative to each of the progressive stages of life that, in due course, follow upon that devotion. Of course, actual spiritual identification with the realized spiritual condition of an adept is limited by the stage of life of the devotee, the effective depth of the self-understanding, and the ego-transcending devotional response of the devotee, and the stage of life and realization of the adept. And some traditions may, unfortunately, tend to replace, or at least to combine, the essential and great practice of devotional communion with the adept guru with concepts and norms associated with the parent-child relationship, or the relationship between a king and a frightened subject, or even the relationship between a slave master and a slave. However, this great principle or means of devotional communion with the adept guru, rightly understood and truly practiced, is the ancient essence or great secret of the spiritual way, and true adept gurus have, therefore, since the most ancient days, been the acknowledged principal sources and resources, as well as the principal means of right religious practice or effective religious wisdom in the esoteric tradition of spiritual realization. Particularly in more modern days, since spirituality and everything else has become a subject of mass communication and popularization, the spiritual way itself has become increasingly subject to conventional interpretation and popular controversy. In the broad social or survival context of the first three stages of life, self-fulfillment, or the consolation of the ego, is the common ideal tempered only by local, popular, and conventional political, social, and religious ideals or demands. Therefore, the common mood is one of adolescent anti-authority and anti-hierarchy, stemming from the Oedipal anti-parent disposition, and the common search is for a kind of ever-youthful and narcissistic ego-omnipotence and ego-omniscience. The popular egalitarian or ego-based and merely and competitively individualistic culture, or really anti-culture, of the first three stages of life is characterized by the politics of adolescent rebellion against authority or the perceived parent in any form. Indeed, a society or any loose collective of mere individuals does not feel the need for, and cannot by tendency alone, even much tolerate a true culture, because a true culture must, necessarily, be characterized in its best and even general demonstrations, and certainly in its aspirations, by mutual tolerance, cooperation, peace, and profundity. Therefore, societies based on competitive individualism and egoic self-fulfillment and mere gross-mindedness or superficial mindedness actually tend to suppress and even destroy right culture and all until then existing right cultures and right cultural adaptations. And right cultures and right cultural adaptations are produced and needed only when individuals rightly and truly participate in a collective, and thus and thereby live in accordance with the life principle of transcending egoity and the great principle of inherent oneness or prior unity. In the popular, egalitarian, or ego-based and merely competitive individualistic culture, or really anti-culture, of the first three stages of life, the guru and the developmental culture of the spiritual way are, with even all of authority and of true or ego-transcending culture, more or less taboo, because every individual, limited or egoically defined by the motives of the first three stages of life, is at war with personal vulnerability and need, or the feeling of egoic insufficiency. However, the real spiritual process does not even begin until the egoic point of view of the first three stages of life is understood, or otherwise ceases to be the limit of aspiration and awareness, and the ego-surrendering and ego-transcending motive of the fourth stage of life begins to move and change the body-mind from the heart. Those who are truly involved in the ego-surrendering and ego-transcending process of the esoteric stages of life are fundamentally no longer at war with their own help, and thus they are no longer struggling toward the ultimate victory of the ego. Therefore, it is only on the spiritual and even anti-spiritual cultural domain of the first three stages of life, or the conventional survival culture, bereft of the motive of true development and spiritual culture, that the guru is in principle taboo. And because that taboo is rooted in adolescent reactivity and egoic willfulness, or the yet unresolved emotional and psychological and even emotional sexual rebellion against childish and emotionally and sexually ego-suppressing dependence on parent-like individuals and influences, anti-guruism and even anti-cultism, which characteristically and without discrimination denigrate and defame and mock or otherwise belittle all authorities, and also even all the seed groups of newly emerging cultural movements, whether or not they have positive merit, are forms or expressions of what Sigmund Freud described as an Oedipal problem. In the common world of humankind, it is yet true that most individuals tend, by a combination of mechanical, psychophysical tendencies and a mass of conventional political, social, and cultural pressures, to be confined to the general point of view associated developmentally with the unfinished or yet to be understood business of the first three stages of life. Thus, in the common world of humankind, even religion is characteristically reduced to what is intended to serve the creaturely or worldly and rather aggressively exoteric point of view and purposes of egoity in the context of the first three stages of life. And even if an interest in the esoteric possibilities beyond the first three stages of life develops in the case of any such yet rather worldly character, that interest tends to be pursued in a manner that dramatizes and reinforces the point of view and the exoteric and either childishly or adolescently egoic inclinations, characteristics of the first three stages of life. Until there is the development of significantly effective self-understanding relative to the developmental problems or yet unfinished business associated with the first three stages of life, anyone who aspires to develop a truly esoteric practice, necessarily beginning in the context of the fourth stage of life, will, characteristically, tend to relate to such possible esoteric practice in either a childish or an adolescent manner. Thus, anyone whose developmental disposition is yet relatively childish or tending in general to seek egoic security via the dramatization of the role of emotionalistic dependency will tend to relate to esoteric possibilities via emotionalistic or otherwise merely enthusiastic attachments, while otherwise in general tending to be weak in both the responsible exercise of discriminating intelligence and the likewise responsible exercise of functional, practical, relational, and cultural self-discipline. Indeed, such childish religiosity, characterized by dependent emotionalism or mere enthusiastic attachment, bereft of discrimination and real self-discipline, is what may rightly, without bad intentions, be described and criticized as cultism. And anyone whose developmental disposition is yet relatively adolescent or tending in general to seek egoic security via the dramatization of the role of reactive independence will tend to relate to esoteric possibilities via generally heady or willful, rather mental or even intellectual or bookish, but not altogether truly intelligent efforts, accompanied either or even alternately by a general lack of self-discipline and a general lack of non-reactive emotional responsiveness, or by an exaggerated, abstractly enforced, and more or less life-suppressing and emotion-suppressing attachment to self-discipline. Such adolescent or heady religiosity merely continues the dramatization of the characteristic adolescent search for independence, or the reactive pursuit of escape from every kind of dependency, and altogether the reactive pursuit of egoic self-sufficiency. And such adolescent seeking is inherently and reactively disinclined toward any kind of self-surrender. Therefore, the rather adolescent seeker tends to want to be his or her own guru in all matters, and, characteristically, the rather adolescent seeker will resist and would even prefer to avoid a truly intelligent, rightly self-disciplined, and altogether devotionally self-surrendered relationship to a true guru. because of their developmental tendencies toward either childish or adolescent ego dramatizations. Those who are yet bound to the point of view or the unfinished business of the first three stages of life are, developmentally, or in the characteristic disposition which is not yet relieved by sufficient self-understanding, also, regardless of their presumed interest, not yet truly ready to enter into the esoteric process beyond the first three stages of life. And for the same developmental reasons, the principal and most characteristic impediments toward true participation in the esoteric process are cultism, or merely emotionalistic dependency bereft of discrimination and self-discipline, intellectualism, or merely mental or even bookish preoccupation disinclined to fully participatory or directly experiential involvement in the esoteric process, and anti-guruism, or reactive attachment to a state of egoic independence, immune to the necessity for devotional self-surrender and the grace of great help. It is not the specific and great function of the adept to fulfill a popular spiritual or otherwise non-spiritual role in common or egoic and early stage society, but to serve as teacher, guide, spiritual transmitter, or free awakener in relation to those who are already and rightly moved and progressively prepared to fulfill the ego-transcending obligations of the great and soon spiritual way itself in the potential developmental context that is beyond the first three stages of life. The only proper relationship to such a realized adept or true guru is, therefore, one of real and right and ego-surrendering and ego-transcending practice, and that practice must, from the beginning, be practically inspired and soon spiritually inspired by ego-transcending devotion, not childish egoity, characterized by cultic dependency, and not adolescent egoity, characterized by willful or otherwise ambivalent independence. Of course, individuals in the earlier or first three stages of life who are not yet actively oriented or otherwise rightly adapted to ego-surrendering and ego-transcending practice may be served by adept gurus, but apart from special instances where an adept must work directly with such individuals in order to establish a new cultural gathering of devotees, or in order to establish a new revelation of the spiritual way, those not yet actively oriented or actively committed or otherwise rightly adapted to truly ego-surrendering and really ego-transcending practice are generally, except perhaps for occasional glimpses of the adept in his or her free demonstration, served or prepared for ego-surrendering, ego-transcending, and soon spiritual practice only through the written or otherwise recorded teachings of an adept, and through the public institutional work and the outer temple or beginner serving institutional work of the practicing devotees of an adept. The realized adept, or any true guru, is primarily an esoteric figure whose unique function serves within the context of the esoteric stages of life. The esoteric stages of life are themselves open only to those who are ready, willing, and able to make the real God realizing, or truth realizing, or reality realizing sacrifice of separate and separative self that is necessary in the context of the esoteric stages of life. Therefore, the necessity and the true nature and great function of a realized adept or true guru is obvious and of supreme value, only to those who are ready, willing, and able to embrace the ego-transcending process of the esoteric stages of life. Except for the possible moments in which the acausal divine person or ultimate reality and truth may, for some few, serve, temporarily and to whatever degree significantly, and in any case, never to the most ultimate or most perfect degree, in or via a non-physical and or perhaps even non-human revelation form. The devotional relationship to the realized adept is an absolute and never obsolete necessity for any and every human being who would practice and realize within the esoteric stages of life. Therefore, the necessity and the true nature and great function of a realized adept or true guru is inherently and gratefully obvious to any one and every one who is truly ready, willing, and able to embrace the esoteric process of real God realization or reality realization. Any one and every one who doubts and quibbles about the necessity and the true nature and great function of a true adept guru is simply not yet ready, willing, and able to enter the necessarily ego-surrendering process of the esoteric stages of life. And no mere verbal or otherwise exoteric argument is sufficient to convince such doubters of the necessity and the true nature and great function of a true adept guru, just as no mere verbal or otherwise exoteric argument is sufficient to make them ready, willing, and able to truly embrace the ego-surrendering process of the esoteric stages of life. Those who doubt the guru principle and the unique value and ultimate necessity of the adept guru are those for whom the great and soon spiritual way itself is yet in doubt. Therefore, such matters remain controversial, and access to the spiritual way and the adept company continues to be effectively denied to ordinary people by the popular taboos and the psychological limitations of the first three stages of life, until the real God-realizing motive awakens the heart's great impulse to grow beyond. Here ends the recitation of the Aletheon, the divine avataric self-revelation of his divine presence, Avatar Adi Da Samraj.